Hey everyone, how's it going? Forrest here, again with another installment of my complete analysis of all of J.S. Bach's chorale harmonizations. Today we're looking at Mitten wieder in Leben sind, which translates to in the very midst of life. This is a longer chorale today, it's a two-pager, but it's going to be relatively straightforward to get through. We have some quirky chord progressions in this one. You might even have some questions about it as you've listened to the introduction audio. That's definitely the relationship that I had with the chorale after listening to it was, wow, some of these progressions sound really quirky, but actually when you get under the hood, it's actually not too bad. And it's always interesting how Bach is able to impart a really sort of angular sound with very modest tonal means. And I think that really the big comment or the big takeaway from this chorale is exactly that, is that Bach, despite using very modest tonal means, he's able to create quite a bit of a modern sound in a couple of the cases, that is. So let's hop into the analysis. We have no key signature. We start on E minor and we end on E major, so maybe there is some idea of modality going on here, or the overall tonality of this chorale is A minor. I do think the overall tonality of this chorale is A minor or C major, maybe A minor because we start with A minor and we end on in the key of A minor, but we do spend quite a bit of time throughout the chorale in the key of C major as well, so maybe just saying this is in the realm of no sharps or flats might be a little bit more accurate, but if I had to pick a side, probably A minor would be the side I'd choose. First phrase ends in a perfect authentic cadence, and you might be wondering, how are we in the key of A minor if we start on E minor? I do think after taking sort of an aggregate of everything that's going on in the phrase, I think that this opening E minor sort of double chord thing that's going on here is a minor dominant. One of the quirky things about this chorale happening right at the beginning here, you could say that we've started in the key of E minor and then we modulate to the key of A minor, but I don't quite hear it that way. Maybe I'm just biased because I listened to the intro a lot with that same sort of thought, like where exactly are we harmonically? Are we in E minor or are we in A minor? And I think both are valid analyses, but I don't think really there's enough justification here to say that we've modulated, other than the fact that minor dominants are relatively rare. But with that being the only thing in mind, I think we just start off with a minor dominant. What makes it exceptionally quirky is the fact that we see it repeated twice. So after our passing seventh on the bass, we have a C, C, E, and A, which is our tonic in first inversion, A minor, passing tone in the bass. Then we get G sharp, B, E, and B, A being an accented non-chord tone, that being E major over G sharp, and that takes us right back to A minor, A, E, and C. F sharp and G sharp are both passing tones, some melodic minor going on, so regardless of how you analyze, we're definitely in the key of A minor by this point. And then we get C, E, A, and C, so those are all chord tones, but it is briefly taking the A minor chord and putting it in first inversion. We then have D, F, A, and B. We know that Bach loves 2-6-5 chords, especially in cadential situations. B and D are both chord tones. E, B, G sharp, and B. B, G sharp, and B. That's a 5 chord, E major in root position, typically where 2-6 or 2-6-5 goes to in a cadential context. E is a chord tone, D is a passing seventh, and then we cadence on A minor. A, C, E, and A. Next phrase ends in a half cadence in the key of A minor, but interestingly, I do believe we go to the key of C very briefly, and just like yesterday's chorale, which I do believe we had a modulation similar to this, even though C and A are not adjacent, they are relative to one another. They share a key signature, basically. When we're going from A minor to G major, it doesn't quite feel like G major is having the same sort of impact in the key of A minor as it would in the key of C major. In other words, it doesn't quite feel like a common chord to me when I hear it in this context. I feel like if there was going to be a common chord between the relative major and the relative minor, it'd have to be something like a non-dominant chord in either of the keys, like D minor or something, or F major. That's just my 2 cents. Or another chord. It could be A minor as well, but it does feel kind of direct to me, coming from sort of like G sharp resolving to G natural on the next beat feels direct to me. It feels like a separate idea, but you could analyze this as a common chord modulation as well. In fact, I'm sure that if this were a different day and I was listening to the chorale differently, this could be a common chord modulation as well, but it just goes to show that there are different interpretations of the same material. But this is G major in root position, G, D, G, and B. That's our 5 chord. Passing 7th on the bass. That takes us to C major, E, G, and C. It's in first inversion. And that takes us to D minor, D, F, A, and D. So that's just in root position. Some passing tones in the lower 3 voices here, giving us a bit of an E minor 7 feel, but we don't have a B in there, so I'm not going to mark it on the page, but the chord's definitely being implied. That takes us to D minor in first inversion, F, D, F, and A. No need to reiterate the Roman numeral in that one. And that takes us to, let's see, B, D, F, and G. That's G7 over B, which is 5, 6, 5. And that takes us to some semblance of a C major chord. We have C, C, with this B flat as well. What's that B flat doing? We have E, which is a known chord tone, and with that G. So here, I think I'm going to use an arrow as well so that we don't bleed into the next beat. But I do think we have a secondary dominant here in the form of 5 of 4. So we do have a resolution here, 2 to 5 to 5 of 4. It does look like it's not resolving the way we would expect, but 5 of 4 is just another C major chord. It just has a flatted 7th in the picture rather than a leading tone 7th in the picture. And Bach does this with quite a bit of frequency, but what he doesn't often do is he doesn't often resolve it irregularly. We do see some secondary deceptive progressions every once in a while, but it's much more common to see the secondary dominant resolve to F. But here we see it resolve to D minor, D, A, E, and F, this E being a 9/8 suspension over what's being kind of tonicized. But this would be a 2 chord, D minor. So 5 of 4 going to 2 is the same thing as 5 going to 6 in the key of F. So that would be the deceptive part of this deceptive progression. And I do think this takes us to the key of A minor, and D minor is becoming our 4 chord. B is a little neighboring tone. C is a neighboring or a passing 7th. D and A are both chord tones, so we don't need to mark them. And that takes us to E major, E, G sharp, B, and E, which concludes our little repeated A section. I'm not even sure if it's an A section that's sort of isolated on its own. A lot of these phrases really have their own unique profile, so the form of this chorale is definitely complex in comparison to the forms that we're expecting to see in one of Bach's chorales. Regardless, next section comes about. I do think we get another direct modulation to C, kind of for the same reason why it feels like we have a direct modulation to C on the next beat. You know, the more that I think about it, maybe this isn't a direct modulation. I'm actually going to walk this back. I think I was confusing it with this one here. I'm going to say in the key of C, this is our 6th chord going to 5, going to 1. Yeah. This would be the alternative analysis that I was talking about earlier, which after comparing with this one, which feels very much like a direct modulation, this doesn't feel so much because we have the G sharp on the other side of the E here, and this E sort of feels more like a pivot to me now that I'm playing it back in my head. Yeah. So you could analyze this as a direct modulation as well. I think that that's totally valid. In the same way that this is a direct modulation, I think this could operate as a direct modulation as well, but the more that I'm hearing it, this 6 sort of turns into a predominant in my mind now that I'm hearing it. So sorry about having to walk that back there, but that just goes to show that analysis down the road can inform your previous decisions when you're putting stuff down on the page. Regardless, this feels more like a direct modulation, and I will not walk this one back. Because of the fact that we have G sharp versus G natural here. So G major versus E major, they feel like separate ideas. So the fact that we're going from A minor to C major, and these are the 2 chords that we see on the end, or at the end, and at the beginning of each phrase respectively, that's what makes it feel separate or direct in this regard. So this G major chord is 5, G, G, B, and D, passing 7th in the bass, and that takes us to C major in first inversion, E, G, C, and E, 1, 6, neighboring 7th here in the alto. That takes us to A, C, C, and F, which is 4, 6, F major. A is a chord tone, so we don't need to mark it. We then have G, B, D, and G. It's our 5 chord in root position, G major. G is a chord tone, so we don't need to mark it. E looks like it's being set up as like a suspension for the next beat, even though it's sort of not operating that way. It just looks like the syncopation is going to be a suspension of some sort, but it's not really. We have A, C, E, and G, which is kind of like a 6-7 chord, a bit of a deceptive progression here. But then we have B, G, which is a chord tone, D, and F, which is G7 over, I'm going to use an arrow here as well, G7 over B, which is 5, 6, 5. And we would expect that to resolve to our tonic, which it does. C, G, D, and E, this D being a 9/8 suspension over the bass. It's common to see 9/8 suspensions over root position tonic triads especially. Then we have G, G, C, and D. And to that same sort of effect, it's very common to see 4/3 suspensions, the C being a suspension here, over root position dominant triads. This little delayed passing 7th is also happening in the tenor as well, before we end with a perfect authentic cadence in the key of C major. Next phrase is going to take us back to the key of A minor. We're going to end in a perfect authentic cadence, but we spend quite a bit of time in the key of C major beforehand. We have C major in first inversion here, E, G, G, and C, so we'll just change the figured bass, passing tone in the bass, and then we get E, G, C, and G again, which is another first inversion C major triad. And I'm going to reiterate the Roman numeral here because I broke the line, or there was a break in the line, and now we're in a new system. So typically if I see the same Roman numeral twice in a row, I won't reiterate it. I'll either change the figure bass if the figure bass changes, or I won't write anything if it's the same spelling or the same chord, not necessarily the same spelling. But yeah, 1, 6 I'm rewriting because it feels kind of bare when you leave it empty here. A little neighbor tone in the bass before we get yet another 1, 6 chord, E, C, C, and G. C and E are both chord tones, but they do briefly take the chord and put it in root position, and that takes us to F major, F, C, F, and A, which is our 4 chord in root position, and the key of A minor, it's also our 6 chord. And then we have a little anticipation here in the tenor before we get G sharp, D, F, and B. I'm going to analyze this as a 7/7 chord. This is a pretty common device that Bach uses in minor keys especially, where he suspends the 7th here, and it does create a fully diminished 7th chord. But if you look at this F as a 7/6 suspension over the bass, and you look at this E as the root of the chord, it actually is 5/6/5 and E7 over G sharp chord. They're basically the same chord both in function and pitch content. The only difference is F and E. So it's really 6 of one, half dozen of another. Regardless of how you analyze it, it's still some type of predominant, dominant tonic progression. A, C, E, and C, which is our A minor, our tonic and root position. B is a passing tone, D is a passing tone, A is a chord tone, but G sharp is a non-chord tone, and we briefly sort of get this passing 7/6 idea here. If this C weren't here, I'd analyze it, but it's almost like we get 1/7/6 going to 1/6 here, kind of this buffer chord that we see. 1/7/6/1 is one of Bach's bread and butter progressions. We see it all the time, but like I said, this C complicates things a little bit from an analytical perspective, at least in terms of how it's going to make its way onto the page. But the next chord is going to be A minor over C. C, E, A, and C. So we don't need to reiterate the Roman numeral. And we have another passing tone here in the bass before we get E, E, A, and B. Again, another 4/3 suspension over the bass with a root position dominant triad. A little neighbor tone here in the alto before we get the resolution to the suspension on the next beat, so we don't need to reanalyze. passing 7th in the tenor, and then we cadence on A minor, A, C, E, and A. Tonic triad, root position. Okay, next phrase ends in a half cadence, and we move to the key of D minor, which is pretty cool. It's pretty indicative, just by looking at the page, that D minor is in our future when we have B flat, whether D minor is being tonicized, or if D minor is going to be our next key. It turns out we modulate there, but we do stay in A minor for a little bit. We start the phrase off with E major, E, E, G sharp, and B, which is our 5 chord. That takes us to A minor, A, E, A, and C. So 5 to 1, passing 7th in the bass. And then we get F, D, A, and D, which is D minor in first inversion. And so we get some passing tones going on in the bass and the alto before we get D minor in root position. D, D, F, and A, which is just taking our chord, putting it in root position so we don't need to reiterate the Roman numeral. And I do think this is now our tonic in the key of D minor. It's a little lower suspension here, sort of like maybe like a 9/10 suspension under the alto. We have C sharp, B flat, E, and G, which is C sharp fully diminished 7th, root position. That takes us to D minor, D, A, E, and F. 9/8 suspension over a tonic triad again. Also, Bach typically does this with D minor chords too. It's like, if you look at some chorales where we just see D minor as a chord, even if it's not functioning as a tonic, we see a lot of 9/8 suspensions over D minor chords especially, which is kind of interesting. I wonder why that ends up being the case. Regardless, the chord sort of resolves the suspension and changes the bass. That's a typical Bach device. 1 going to 1/6, technically speaking, because it's sort of like a swap going on here before we cadence on 5. A, C sharp, and E. And that's going to take us to a phrase that is in the key of C major. And I think for the most part we we start off in the key of C major. We have F, C, F, and A. And for the same reason why I feel like we have a direct modulation moving from our, I guess, A section to the B section, I think we're moving directly to the key of C major for the same reason, where we have C sharp versus C natural. So this F major chord feels like a 4 chord, even though it is directly related, or I guess, it is directly related, but we are directly modulating. I didn't want to confuse the terms here. We are, there is a relationship between F major and D minor. They share a key signature. I just feel like with C natural and C sharp in this context, they do feel like separate ideas. But afterwards we have this passing 7th in the alto that takes us to G major, G, C, D, and G, which is our 5 chord. The C is a 4/3 suspension over the bass. We talked about how 4/3 suspensions are common over dominant triads and root position especially. And that takes us to not C major like we would expect, but rather A minor, A, C, and E. Another 4/3 suspension here over a 6 chord, not over a 5 chord, which is pretty interesting. But then we go to D minor in root position. A typical place for 6 to go is 2, D, A, D, and F, 2 chord, passing 7th in the bass. That takes us to B, G, D, and G. It's 5/6, G major, first inversion. Then we have G, B, D, and this little delayed passing F here, which does kind of take the chord and turn it into a root position G7 chord, which is relatively rare. We don't see that configuration all that often. But regardless, we cadence on C major. Or sorry, not on C major. What am I talking about? It's not a perfect authentic cadence. It's a deceptive cadence. We cadence on A minor. Apologies, I misread my notes there. In my defense, on my notes, I would show them to you if they weren't so difficult to move on my desk. D kind of looks like a P, so actually I would have mistaken this for a plagal cadence, but I think I was just on autopilot here. Yeah, no, this is a 6 chord, 5 going to 6. This is one of 2 deceptive cadences in this chorale, which is pretty exciting. Okay, next phrase goes on to the next page. It ends in an imperfect authentic cadence, but before I flip the page, we have another A minor chord. It's basically the exact same spelling. We have A and C, but instead of C and E, we have E and we have A. So I don't need to reiterate the Roman numeral there, and we're just going to go to the next page. Next page starts us off with a 5 chord G major in first inversion. We have B, B, D, and G, which is 5/6. C, G, D, and E. Again, 9/8 suspension over our root position tonic triad. A little passing 7th there before we get D, F, A, and F, which is our 2 chord D minor. Little passing tone here in the tenor getting really low here, and then we have B, D, D, and G, which is 5/6, G major over B, and then we get a similar cadential thing going on here. It's another, this time it's not a, sorry, I almost did it again. It's not a deceptive cadence, it's an imperfect authentic cadence, but the lower voices are doing something very similar. We have G, we have G, we have B, and we have G. So it's not an entirely intact triad, but basically all of the components are there. If we had a D, I would analyze it, but it's kind of like the chords being thrown into root position from being in first inversion. And then we have a tonic triad here, C, G, C, and E, which is how I thought the previous phrase analyzed because I was on autopilot, but no, I'm glad that I caught that. Next phrase takes us back to the key of A minor in a similar fashion to the end of the A section, where we get A minor introduced at the very end, at least in my opinion. There's an argument to be made that we modulate the key of A minor here, but I'll talk about why I don't think that's the case when we get there. Also, let me reorient myself here, because all of the flipping does have a tendency to make the pages kind of harder for you to read. I know they're already somewhat difficult to read, but this is the means that I have to analyze, and it feels better to write on the page than it does to analyze on a computer screen. So anywho, we start the phrase off with A minor, A, C, E, and A. It's our 6th chord. C briefly takes the chord and puts it in first inversion. Then we get C, B, E, and G. E, B, E, and G, which is our 3 chord, a bit of a transitive progression here. And what I mean by transitive is that typically chords move along the cycle of falling fifths, 2 going to 5, 5 going to 1. That's typically how the chords we expect to move when they are a 4th apart or a 5th apart. But here typically 3 goes to 6, not the other way around. That isn't to say that it can't go the other way around. It very often does. It's just, I call it a transitive progression because it demonstrates the fact that if 3 can go to 6, 6 can also go to 3 because they're next to each other. It's a relationship that goes 2 ways. So yeah, transitive progression, like the transitive property in math. Passing 7th in the bass here before we get C, C, E, and A. It's A minor in first inversion. And if you wanted to analyze in the key of A minor, you could start the analysis here, or maybe, I would say you could actually start the analysis here. But I think this phrase that happened, or this fragment of the phrase that happens around this section, feels too C major-like for me to really warrant the modulation just yet. It feels like a false tonicization or a false modulation through tonicization. So we have a passing tone in the bass, and then we have A, B, E, and B, but this A is a accented non-chord tone. It's really this G sharp that is 5/6 of 6, or this would just be 5 if you were in the key of A minor already, and that takes us right back to A minor, A, E, and C, which is just our 6th chord in root position. Now, we have this situation sometimes where Bach sandwiches 2 like chords with their dominant, and it feels like 6 is a common chord for this to happen with, and it does give off an indication like, wait, have we modulated yet? It does bring that into question, but the reason why I don't think we've modulated yet has to do with the progression after the fact. That is 6 going to G major, B, D, this F is a passing tone by the way, G, and B, which would be 5/6 in the key of C, a little suspended 7th here, little passing tone in the alto as well before we get C major, C, G, F, and G. This F being a 4-3 suspension over a tonic triad, which is pretty cool. But yeah, 6-5-6-1. It just feels like a 5-1 progression in the key of C major, and I don't think this is enough development to be a modulation. It's really, really close, but what we have after the fact sort of reverses the effect that the modulation had. But C major is our the root of our chord. B's a little passing seventh, and then we go to D minor, D, A, E, and F. Again, another 9/8 suspension over a D minor chord. So in this case it's 2, but in the key of A minor it's 4. D is a chord tone. It's actually very similar to the cadence that we had at the beginning of the A section. B is a non-chord tone, A is a chord tone, C is a passing seventh, and then we have E major, E, G sharp, B, and E, which is our 5-chord root position. Okay, next phrase might be the most interesting phrase in the whole chorale. Definitely is a contender for first place, I think. We end in an imperfect authentic cadence in the key of C, but we start with a very unusual chord. We have G, G, B flat, and D. So we definitely have a direct modulation, but a direct modulation to what? Well, if we look at the chord progressions that we have, or if we look at the chords that we have here, we have G minor, we have F major, and then we have D minor before we go to G major, and then a turnaround that turns us into C major, like a imperfect authentic cadence. So how exactly does this G minor fit into the discussion? Because it feels very out of place, harmonically speaking. And I think the only way that I can justify this is by a brief but very noticeable modulation to the key of F major. And the only reason why I think we're in the key of F major is because G minor, F major, and D minor, I think can only be found in like 2 different keys, B flat and F, off the top of my head. Or maybe not E flat. E flat would have F minor. So yeah, it's either B flat, which has D minor, G minor, and F, which I don't think we're going to the key of B flat here, because that would be like a 6-5-3 progression. I think in the key of F we have 2 going to 1. Another 2-1 progression, which is coincidental because yesterday we had a 2-1 progression in the chorale we analyzed. And it's relatively rare just to see 2 go to 1. And why Bach went to the key of F major here feels really interesting. It almost feels like this D was supposed to be an E, and it was supposed to be like 7 of 4 or something like that in the key of F, or in the key of C, sorry. But no, it is a G minor chord, and it's like it's a very interesting chord that makes me sort of think about the role of like 2 being a counterpart to 7, because they're very similar in terms of their content, but really we just have like this plagal-ish progression in the key of F to start things off. And then I think this is where we could, start the modulation of the key of C major, but I don't think it happens just yet, because there's nothing inherently more C major like about the next chord, D minor, until we than it is a C major chord. So we have a passing seventh in the bass, and then we have D, D, F, and A, which is 6 in the key of F, and it's also 2 in the key of C. So this little fragment here, how do we know we're in the key of F? There's no dominant and there's only a tonic, and really I think the only thing that sort of signals us the fact that we're in the key of F is the fact that the 3 chords in the progression are relative to the key of F. You can find them in the key of F. The fact that G minor I think is being used in place of like E diminished or C7 is an interesting statement. It's definitely the first time I've seen the chord be used in this context in Bach, and it just feels unusual, and I think that's because it is unusual, but it's really fascinating when we encounter little like deviations like this. But yeah, I think we're in the key of F, and 2 is sort of operating as like a quasi-dominant. It doesn't really have any dominance over the key, over F, because it doesn't have a leading tone, and all the voices are just sort of moving in parallel, or at least most of them are moving. The inner voices are moving in parallel, and the melody is moving up a fifth. Pardon me. But yeah, it's interesting how the chord is moving from one to the next. It's not quite dominant. We would need like an E in there for it to be dominant, which is why I feel like keeping the E from the previous beat would have made a little bit more sense harmonically to fit the narrative that we would expect. But yeah, F is sort of like this is an instance where we see a modulation to a key, and it's there to sort of make sense of chords that otherwise wouldn't fit in the key before or the key after, and we see these sort of brief modulations that lack a tonic sometimes, or lack a dominant in some cases as well, every once in a while. So regardless, we're still in the key of C now. Passing 7th in the bass, we have B, D, F, and G. It's G7, first inversion. G is a chord tone, B is a chord tone, E is a non-chord tone, so we'll mark it. Reminds me of something that we saw earlier as well, before we get not A minor, but rather F major 7 in first inversion, A, C, E, and F. So that's 4, 6, 5. 5, 6, 5 sort of going to like a deceptive harmony here, where we have A in the bass that just ends up being a turnaround for the next chord, which is B, G, D, and F. D is a non-chord tone in this context. I'm going to use an arrow here because it can get kind of spacious in terms of occupying a lot of real estate on the page when you have parentheses and Roman numerals going on with the figured bass. But yeah, 4, 6, 5 going to 5, 6, 5. Very common subdivided chord progression in Bach. That's going to take us to 1, C, G, C, and E, the end of a very interesting phrase. Let me know if you have any opinions about what this could be alternatively as well. If you don't agree that it's in the key of F, it took a little while for me to sort of figure that out, but it got somewhere. But yes, next phrase is going to take us to our second of two deceptive chord progressions, or deceptive cadences in this chorale. We start off in the key of C major still, and then we move to the key of G major. So we have C, C, E, and A. So we don't start off with a C major triad, we start off with A minor in first inversion, which is 6, 6, passing tone on the bass, and then we get E, C, E, and G. But again, this B flat makes an appearance, which makes me feel like this C major chord isn't exactly a C major chord as a tonic, but rather a C major chord as a dominant of 4. And this is something that we see all the time in Bach, where 5 also, or 1 also operates as 5 of 4. And the thing about 5 of 4 in major keys, unlike minor keys where the chord has to turn from minor to major, is that the chord is major, and unless we have that flatted 7th, we don't know for a fact that it's operating as a dominant of 4, even if it goes to a 4 chord, because 1 still wants to go to 4 via the cycle of falling fifths. It's the B flat that tells us that it does have a higher function, in my opinion at least. But it does take us to 4, which is a good sign. F, A, C, and A. F major, passing 7th in the bass, passing tone in the tenor, before we get D, A, D, D, F, D, and B, which is 7, 6, B diminished over D. And that takes us to C major, C, G, E, and C. Tonic triad, root position. We have a modulation to the key of G major here, where C major now becomes our 4 chord. And interestingly, we have E, G, and B with this C here, which is just taking the chord and turning it into a 7th after the modulation, which is pretty cool, because we have an entirely intact major 7 chord here. And that takes us to 5, D, A, G, and A. This G is a 4-3 suspension over the bass. Again, it's very common to see 4-3 suspensions over root position dominant chords especially. D is a chord tone, C is a little passing seventh, and then we cadence not on G major, but on E minor. E, B, G, and G, which is our sixth chord. Our penultimate phrase takes us to the key of D minor again, but we're going to go there through C major. So we have a half cadence at the end in the key of D minor. We start things off in the key of C major. We have a C major chord at the beginning, E, E, G, and C, which is 4-6 in the key of G major. It's also 1-6 in the key of C major. We have a passing tone in the bass, and then we have G, D, G, and B, which is our 5 chord, G major, with a passing tone in the tenor this time. And then we get another transitive progression, almost like a deceptive progression, because if 5 goes to anywhere other than like a tonic functioning chord, it's sort of like a deceptive progression for that reason, because we expect 5 to take us to the tonic, functionally speaking. But afterwards we get D, F, A, and D, which is our 2 chords. So transitive and deceptive. 2 typically goes to 5, and we would expect 5 to go to 1, but it goes to 2. Passing tones in the lower 3 voices, where we have E, E, G, and D, just like earlier where we thought we had like a passing fully intact E minor 7 chord here. We're missing the B to make it fully intact, but the chord for all intents and purposes is there as sort of like a buffer between the 2 D minor chords, F, D, A, and A. Just taking the chord, putting it in first inversion. I think that on the next beat we're going to modulate. Actually, we could say that the modulation happens here, but I feel like seeing a G7 chord before or after the modulation might not make the most sense from the departure from C major, because this looks like a 2-6 going to a 5 progression after these passing tones in the inner voices. We have F, B, D, and G, which is 5-4-2, and we would expect that to resolve to 1-6 in the key of C major, but instead we get an interesting turnaround here where 5-4-2 goes to the key of A minor, where it is now 4-4-2, and this B natural is, or sorry, not A minor, D minor, apologies. We would expect B natural, which is the raised 6th scale degree in the key of D minor, to go to C sharp, then to go to D. So we would expect this 4-4-2 chord now to go to 7-6, which it does, which I think is really cool. A 4-2 chord being repurposed as another 4-2 chord in a different key, and having that be the resolution is a pretty nifty chord progression that is really beautiful both analytically and sonically. So we have, here I'm going to use an arrow as well, we have E, C sharp, E, and G, which is 7-6, and typically we expect 4-2 chords to resolve based on 2 criteria. We expect it to resolve down by step. That's pretty much every single 4-2 chord, is that the bass will resolve down by step, and the roots are typically a 5th apart. So 4 would want to go to 7, so it follows that cycle of falling 5ths. We don't always see the second criteria, but most often we do. So 4-4-2 going to 7 is a pretty nifty chord, or 7-6 more specifically, is a pretty nifty chord progression, especially when it is coming from the key of C major, and we would expect 5-4-2 to resolve to C major. The fact that it's resolving to a C sharp chord is based on the fact that in the key of D minor, the chord is being recontextualized, and I think that's a really beautiful thing. But anywho, after 7-6, we have D, D, A, and F, which is our tonic triad. That briefly gets turned into first inversion when we take all of the chords on the and, or all of the notes on the and of the harmonic rhythm. We have F, A, D, and F, which then takes us to 5, A major, A, C sharp, and E. And then our last phrase has a bit of an interesting progression at the end. We have some chromaticism in the bass here, and we have a half cadence. So it's always interesting when Bach ends a chorale without a perfect authentic cadence, and yeah, he loops it back around to the key of A minor, but I think we start off in the key of D minor because our half cadence resolves. So we have 5 go to 1 here, F, A, D, and D. So it's 1 in first inversion, passing tones in the lower voices, and then we get D, F, D, and A, which is just taking our chord and putting it in root position. And I do believe this is where we move to the key of A minor, where it's now our 4 chord. We have a little neighbor tone in the tenor here before we get A, F, C, and A. I suppose that this could be a point where we modulate as well. I do think seeing C natural on the harmonic rhythm after a tonic triad, though, is... it could happen. It could go to a 6 chord. Like in this case here we have A minor, we have 4 going to 6, 6, which is kind of interesting. Then we have B, F, D, and A, which is like a 2 chord here, which is... that is kind of like a 2-6-5 chord actually, and 6 wants to go to 2-6-5. And then we get a string of sort of adjacent harmonies here, so I think that this is the start. And with the B natural happening on the end of this beat, it sort of feels like the modulation has already happened. But again, modulation can happen on either of these beats. It could even happen here if you hear it that way. But after our 2-6-5 chord, we would expect a 5 chord, but instead we get 3. We have C, E, G, and G, C major. 2 going to 3 is an interesting progression in minor keys because it feels like 2 is the leading tone chord of 3 just by virtue of the fact that it is in a major context, but the fact that we're in a minor key here sort of makes it feel like 2 is tonicizing 3, but in the grander scheme of things we just have like a rising line here where we have 2 going to 3, going to 4, going to 5. And even more interestingly, on the and of this beat we have the C sharp and this A here, which takes the chord, and I'll put an arrow as well just that we don't clog up the space. We have A7 over C sharp, which is 5-6-5 of 4. So we just have a passing dominant of the next chord, which is D minor, our 4 chord. D, A, E, and F. Again, a 9/8 suspension over a D minor chord. It feels almost like an exception to the norm, which is we typically expect it over a tonic triad. And to be fair, D minor is our temporary tonic here because it was just tonicized, but regardless, 9/8 suspension over our bass is typically something we see over tonic triads, and we see it over D minor even when it's not being tonicized. So we have 4. With this, we've seen this cadential configuration too, I feel like, over here, where we have B, which is a non-chord tone, and C, which is a passing 7th, but D and A being chord tones here. And then we cadence on 5, E, G sharp, B, and E for a half cadence. And that is today's analysis. I think like the big takeaways, or I guess the takeaways that I found particularly interesting were at the very beginning, if we can remember, we have the minor dominance here, which if you analyze it in the key of E minor is not a big takeaway, but if you analyze it in the key of A minor, it is a big takeaway. We have a 2-to-1 progression, which happens here in the key of F, which is particularly fascinating, still kind of a head scratcher. I don't really know exactly what Bach was going for there. I wouldn't expect a G minor chord just to happen immediately after E major. It's an interesting relationship of chords. And also this chromatic bass line here at the end is something that I don't want to ignore, even though it's very brief. It's pretty cool how Bach, with ascending chromatic bass lines, it's typically a leading tone to the next chord anyways, so it's operating the way like we would expect, but still chromatic bass lines are pretty cool. And other than that, I think all of the key relationships are neighboring, so there's nothing really to say. Actually, A to N, those are close. Oh, F to C, yeah, those are close. Yeah, I don't think there are any 2 keys that are distant, so that's pretty cool that a long chorale is consists exclusively of keys that are not distant. It's very common for chorales of this length to get at least one key relationship that is distant, just by virtue of the fact that there's a lot of material and a lot of development, and sort of working back to another key requires the keys to be further apart, for the sake of the real estate of the chorale and how much time Bach has to develop or remodulate back. But yeah, we don't have any direct modulations to distant keys, or common chord modulations to distant keys for that matter as well. But I think on those thoughts I'm going to cap this video off. If you're interested in following me along on the journey to analyze all of Bach's chorale harmonizations, feel free to subscribe to the channel. You can hit the notification icon and like the video if you enjoyed the content as well. Thank you so much for watching the video and supporting the channel by doing so. I look forward to tomorrow's analysis, and I hope you take care.